Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Along 1,600 miles of the Eastern Seaboard, from Maine to Florida, sea level rise, subsidence, and more potent storms are challenging the National Park Service to figure out how best to protect wildlife and their habitats, as well as historic structures, archaeological sites, modern infrastructure, landscapes, and, of course, you, the visitor. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. In the coming months, we'll be examining impacts tied to climate change and how the National Park Service is responding to them. We'll bring you the concerns of residents and communities that are left with the damage from hurricanes and the loss of tax revenues from tourism, and trace the strain these events have on the Park Service staff and budget. We'll also talk to experts about how natural landscapes, such as barrier reefs and salt marshes, and wildlife are being impacted. We're going to have one of those conversations today with two experts from the Nature Conservancy, Dr. Alison Branco, the Nature Conservancy's Climate Adaptation Director, and Dr. Nicole Maher, the organization's Senior Coastal Scientist. We'll be back in a minute with Alison and Nicole.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Dr. Branco and Dr. Maher.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
You know, as I said in my introduction, we're at the National Parks Traveler embarking on a months-long, and it'll definitely run into the fall and maybe into the winter, series of stories looking at national parks along the Eastern Seaboard, from Maine to Florida, roughly 1,600 miles, linear miles if you start tracing all the bays and estuaries. I'm sure it might even double that. But looking at the impacts of climate change and sea level rise and more potent storms, whether it's a tropical storm or a hurricane. And so I appreciate your time today to join me and talk about these issues. And I'm curious, from the Nature Conservancy's viewpoint, I mean, what type of projections do you guys see for sea level rise and impacts along that Eastern Seaboard area?
I don't have the projections in front of me, but so we have been experiencing sea level rise, and we know that it is accelerating, and we are going to have some dramatic changes in frequency of flooding and frequency of coastal storm events. And so it's top of mind when thinking about conserving the habitats that we care about and coastal communities that we care about.
Dr. Branco?
And some of the worst case projections in our region of the country in the Northeast, we could see up to 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. And so on a coastal landscape, that can really change the shape of the land and the communities along the shoreline.
You know, it's really interesting. You talk about by the end of the century. I mean, here we are in 2024, so that's 76 years yet to come. But at the same time, we're seeing effects already of changes in climate, whether you want to call it changes in climate, changes in weather, but certainly changes in the oceans, sea level rise, for instance. There was a story out of Gateway National Recreation Area in the greater metropolitan New York area not too long ago, where I think it was a year ago, they had come in and beach renourishment, so to speak, and they dumped, I don't know if it was hundreds of tons of sand to protect the shoreline there, and the expectation was that it would last 4 or 5 years, and they'd have to do it again. And lo and behold, 1 year later, it's gone. And so these types of things are happening, I don't know, what, more unexpectedly, more quicker than people anticipated?
Well, so Kurt, you mentioned the projections at the end of the century, but we know that we're experiencing sea level rise right now, and our coastal habitats are not keeping pace with those recent rates of sea level rise even now. So from a salt marsh perspective, across New York, our marshes are not keeping pace with the recent tidal epic rate of sea level rise on the order of 4 to 5 millimeters a year. In fact, they're falling short on the order of 1 to 3 millimeters a year. So every year they are losing ground relative to increasing sea level rise, even though they are growing vertically in response. And what we've found in New York is that the missing component that these marshes need to do a better job of keeping pace with sea level rise, is the growth component that they do within their actively growing root zone, where they store organic matter and carbon and grow lots of roots and rhizomes below ground to help them keep their head above water and keep pace with sea level rise. So we know that the factors that influence the vertical growth of salt marshes within the root zone are where we need to target our conservation efforts to help these systems better keep pace with sea level rise and changing climate conditions.
How can you do that?
So we know that chronic elevated nutrient loading to our coastal waters can impact the integrity of salt marsh peat and can change the way that salt marshes grow above and below ground. And certainly elevated chronic nutrient levels increases the rate of decomposition of organic matter, that carbon that we want stored in the salt marsh peat and not released to the atmosphere to further accelerate climate change. So by taking efforts to better treat our human sort of wastewater, sewage treatment plants, we can hope to give our coastal habitats the clean water that they need to thrive. Another factor that could be impacting the growth of salt marshes within this peat zone is altered hydrology. We've been altering the way water moves into and out of our salt marshes for hundreds of years. Colonial farmers were manipulating the way water moved into and out of farmers. And now these altered systems are facing accelerated sea level rise. And many of the symptoms of marsh loss that we're experiencing on the east coast of the US, where our marshes are starting to sink and resemble waffles filled with maple syrup, is because the water isn't moving into and out of these systems in a way to let the plants grow vigorously. And there are a couple other factors too, but those are two of the big ones.
Is part of the problem development? I mean, we're hardening the shorelines. We're minimizing the available landscape that the marsh can expand to or retreat to, I guess, depending on the water levels.
That's absolutely part of the situation. Alison, do you want to address that, or should I?
Yes, all along the entire coast of the United States, people love water so much that we've built right up to the edge to it to be as close to it as we possibly can. And now that sea level is rising, what happens to our marshes, especially, and this is true also for beaches and sand dunes, they're now getting squeezed between the development and the rising water. And so in a natural habitat where there is no development, many of those ecosystems have the ability to migrate inland as sea level rises, wetlands in particular. But when there's development there, they're not able to do that because there are roads and homes and driveways and things like that in their way. And so the available area for those habitats gets squeezed because they exist in that very specific intertidal elevation. And so as the water moves up, they're not able to move further inland. And that's why we're losing a lot of salt marshes all along the coastline.
And why is that an issue? I mean, I grew up in New Jersey. We'd go down to the coast for summer vacations. My parents retired to Cape Cod. I remember going out on the mud flats and it was fun to feel the mud squish between your toes, but there's a lot of biting insects out there, and it stinks in places because of the rotting materials. What's so important about a salt marsh?
Well, where to begin almost, because we depend on salt marshes in more ways than we commonly recognize. They provide so many benefits to both people and nature. They fuel our coastal food web. They provide habitat to wildlife. They cycle nutrients and store carbon. They filter particulates and pollutants out of the water so that we people can enjoy clean coastal waters. They attenuate wave energy to reduce flood risk and control erosion. So in sum, the coastal salt marshes protect a healthy coastal ecosystem and all of the socioeconomic activities that depend on that.
Have you been able to attach a dollar figure to that, the natural capital held within salt marshes?
There are people who have made those calculations, but from a coastal ecologist point of view, from my point of view, I always feel like that may sort of fall short. And so it may be valuing salt marshes, whether you're sort of a coastal fisheries person or someone who just enjoys beautiful open spaces, or whether you're, I think it's, from my perspective, it's very hard to assign a dollar value, but I know that efforts have been made to do that.
Talking about more potent storms and hurricanes, I mean, we just saw Hurricane Beryl charge through the Caribbean and then up into the Gulf of Mexico and come ashore in Texas. And it came ashore as a Category 1 storm. And yes, I believe it was the earliest storm to materialize in the Atlantic by the calendar date. And yet it was just a Category 1 storm, and yet the devastation wrought in Texas has been quite substantial. Is that an example of what's to come? I mean, can we look into the crystal ball and say, this is what we've been warning about and this is what we're going to see more of?
We certainly expect to see big storms like hurricanes to happen more often. This hurricane season will sort of expand as the temperature rises. We've heard a lot of talk over this past winter of how warm the ocean water is, and everyone has been predicting a difficult hurricane season because of that, because a lot of the energy from hurricanes comes from the heat that's in the ocean. So as the planet continues to warm, the ocean will continue to be warmer every summer, and so we can expect more frequent hurricanes, and we can expect more of those to be really severe. And I think, we're seeing changes also in the way hurricanes work. They're moving slower, hanging around longer, and that also increases the amount of damage they can do, especially when they dump a lot of rain in one place for a long time.
Yeah, I think it was back in 2017. I can't remember the name of the storm that came through, but at Cape Lookout National Seashore on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, it actually created 50 breaches in the barrier islands there. Just a phenomenal number. And as I understand it, if I recall correctly, the breaches didn't come from the ocean side, but rather as the rivers were draining back into the ocean following the storm surge. You can look at Cape Hatteras National Seashore just to the north of Cape Lookout, and we can see what's going on with the movement of barrier islands to the human infrastructure as houses are collapsing into the Atlantic Ocean, as the high tide line is moving and reclaiming more of that barrier island. What's happening to the ecosystems of the salt marshes and the barrier islands? Let's talk about the wildlife and the marine life. How are they being impacted by these occurrences?
Well, certainly these occurrences can be sort of very damaging to human communities sort of along the coastline, but these are dynamic coastal ecosystems. Barrier islands are supposed to move. And big storms like that can be either erosional events or depositional events for salt marsh habitats. And in fact, coastal salt marshes need to experience those episodic events so that they're resilient to them in the future. And so that's something that's so hard to balance when we people have built our communities in place along these systems, and we want to hold a sandbar in place, or it's a challenge, because in order to protect the resilience of these dynamic coastal systems, we need them to experience dynamic events that they're going to experience more and more into the future. And I know that it's a hard sort of idea to grapple with or to understand sometimes for those of us who for fixed infrastructure and settlements along the coast.
Yeah.
The ecosystems on the barrier islands are adapted to that kind of dynamism and those kind of big dramatic events that change the shape of the island. And often there are big washover events, or as you mentioned, new breaches developing different places. And the ecosystems are, the plants and animals that live on barrier islands are adapted to those types of events. And as Nicole mentioned, often rely on them to supply sand or to create a big sand flat that has no vegetation on it. That's an important habitat for a lot of shorebirds. So although it might look to humans like a very damaging event, it often is valuable to the ecosystem because it creates this unique habitat that some plants and animals are really uniquely adapted to.
Right, that's definitely the case with sort of breaches and sand washovers on Barrier Island creating habitat for shorebirds. But even salt marshes, they're slowly growing to keep pace with sea level rise, but it doesn't happen at a steady rate. They need those pulses that deposit sand and sort of give them a jump. And sometimes marshes that haven't been keeping pace with sea level rise can experience a coastal storm that deposits a sand layer that gives them a 10-year boost.
Yeah. I'm just a writer. It wasn't until my last semester of college that I took a geology course, and I really, at times, wish I took it my freshman year because I'd probably be on a whole different professional track. But I'm curious, I know barrier islands move. They're designed to move. Do we know how much barrier islands like Cape Hatteras, Cape Lookout have moved over the centuries, over the millennia? Are they basically in the same place they've always been and just kind of shifting forms?
I think I'm not the person to answer that question, but my understanding is that coastal geologists have done a lot of that historic mapping and can show when and what rates barrier islands have moved.
I think often they are in sort of approximately the same place. The barrier islands in North Carolina, certainly Fire Island on the south shore of Long Island, where there's the Fire Island National Seashore. There has been a barrier island there for quite some time, obviously not forever because it was formed by glaciers, but you can see the changes. There's a lighthouse on Fire Island, just at the edge of the Fire Island National Seashore that used to be the end of the island, and that's why there was a lighthouse there. And there's now several miles of sand on the other side of it because the island has been moving and changing and migrating westward. So although it's always been sort of off the south shore of Long Island, it has been moving and changing quite a bit.
Yeah, and of course, if you look at Cape Hatteras National Seashore, it wasn't too many years ago that they actually had to move Cape Hatteras Light because of the erosion that was going on and the shifting of the barrier island there. Alison, you had mentioned about how these storm surges, I guess, erase and create habitat for wildlife. And I know there was one situation not too many years ago, again at Cape Hatteras National Seashore, where researchers found an area that had been scoured by a storm and just leveled, and it just created incredible habitat for piping plovers as they were migrating. Was that a one-off, or do we see that more often than we think?
We do see that a lot. Piping plovers need that sort of, what looks to humans as a pretty bare, useless landscape, just an empty beach. But that's really critical habitat for birds like piping plovers. They won't build their nest if there are a lot of grasses and other things there. They need that sort of almost fresh sand type of habitat. So when you sort of scour and flatten an area that may have been stable for a while and had accumulated some plants and other things, it's almost like a refresh to that sort of bare sand habitat. And it might be damaging for certain species, but it can be important for ones like the piping plover that are endangered.
So, getting back to the impacts of storms on habitat, sea turtles are running into lots of issues with climate change issues, whether it's sea level rise, erasing beaches, or warmer temperatures baking the sands and affecting the sex ratio of the hatchlings coming out. And I was talking to one biologist who told me that even birth defects are being attributed to how hot the sand is when the eggs are being incubated. And we hear a lot about migratory birds like the plovers. What about red knots? I know red knots are a listed species. Is it because of loss of habitat? Is it because of climate change? Can we identify the exact cause?
Red knots are hugely dependent on the food source of an abundant horseshoe crab egg supply. And as we armor our shorelines and limit the amount of accessible beachfront that horseshoe crabs need to lay their eggs in abundance to both continue their own population and support migratory birds like red knots, that is certainly a huge concern for the red knot population. Another bird species that is very threatened right now and currently under evaluation for listing under the Endangered Species Act is the salt marsh sparrow. And salt marsh sparrows are extreme salt marsh specialists. They live their entire lives in salt marshes. They breed in the salt marshes of the Northeast. They overwinter in the salt marshes of the Southeast, and they're endemic to the East Coast of the US. They exist nowhere else in the world. The success of salt marsh sparrows breeding in our marshes represents an extreme measure of resilience for our coastal salt marshes, not only for that species of bird, but other species of birds and wildlife that depend on our salt marsh habitats, but all of the other benefits that salt marshes provide to people in terms of cycling nutrients and reducing risk from coastal storms. So they're like our canary in the coal mine. If we have a marsh system where salt marsh sparrows are able to successfully breed, it represents a higher level of resilience for all of the things that we care about with our salt marshes. I think the salt marsh sparrows are an incredible sort of case study right now, because they really do, the success of salt marsh sparrows that depend on building their nests within the intertidal zone of the salt marsh, and they depend on having 23 days without excessive flooding to successfully raise a clutch of eggs. Really, they are at the cutting edge of the vulnerability in terms of coastal wildlife responding to climate change in the salt marsh. And so when their populations are on the decline throughout their whole region because of increased flooding, because our salt marshes are at a lower elevation and we're experiencing more and more flooding events, they need that 23-day window between highest flooding events of the month to successfully raise a clutch of eggs. And so when we find that they really do represent an incredible measure of resilience for salt marsh habitats, not just for their own species, but for other species of wildlife and for us people along the coast. So they are really sort of an incredible story where we're trying to figure out how to protect that level of resilience in our coastal marshes for the salt marsh sparrows and everyone else that depends on them.
Are they a listed species?
They are not yet, but they are currently under evaluation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we anticipate a decision this September.
You know, we talked about the sea turtles. Northern right whales have been in the news a lot because there's so few of them, and when you lose one of them, it's a big deal. Can we say how they're being affected by climate change? I know they have off Georgia, northern Florida coastlines, Cumberland Island, National Seashore for folks who are focused on national parks, and then they typically move north during the summer. Are they just being impacted by ship traffic, or is the climate change impacting them as well?
Our colleague Carl LeBou could speak more about whale populations and how they're being impacted by ship traffic, but also changes in availability of food. I don't think that I can do as good a job in describing the climate change effects on right whales and other whales. Alison?
That's definitely true, and I would agree. I would just say that I think whales are very mobile and have the ability to sort of follow the food. As you know, we do expect fish populations to move around a bit as the temperatures change in the ocean, but whales would typically have the ability to sort of change with them and follow them and find them. I think that gets harder and harder when you only have a few whales. We're really talking very small numbers when it comes to right whales and some others as well. It gets harder for them to be able to find their food source, but also a lot of the deaths of whales that we're seeing, and even just harm to whales, is ship traffic based. And I think, as conservation efforts have brought back some of their food sources that are coastal, unfortunately, kind of a side effect of that is that the tremendous amounts of ship traffic that we're seeing these days, which are, by the way, really exacerbating climate change. That's a tremendous amount of fuel we use to move our goods and things around the world. All of that ship traffic is just coming into contact with whales more often as they're coming into the coastal areas to find their food.
Speaking about coastal areas and sea level rise, I know one of the concerns is that it's pushing seawater further inland than in the past. And you go down to Florida Bay in the southern tip of Everglades National Park, and we're seeing mangroves showing up farther and farther inland than they normally would be expected to show up. Is that an isolated problem, or are we seeing this along the coast, whether it's mangroves or some other species that are salt tolerant?
I think we are seeing the migration of habitats responding to climate change, whether it's flooding or temperatures. And sort of as conservationists, we know that we need to conserve the stage, sort of allow these habitats that we want to persist into the future, the space to move landward and adapt. And it's going to bring species from one location to another that haven't seen them before. But our world is changing, and our habitats need to change with it.
And it's not only overland that we have seawater encroaching, but it's also underground. So, there's typically some salt water that's coming into the underground aquifer on the coast. And as sea level rises, that pushes in further, and even the freshwater lens on top of it rises up more shallow. On Fire Island National Seashore, there's a very unique ecosystem, what they call the sunken forest, a globally rare ecosystem that is getting waterlogged because sea level rise is pushing up the groundwater, and it's just much wetter than it typically would be. And it's at risk. We're at risk of losing this globally rare ecosystem, not because sea level is causing overland flooding, but because it's pushing the groundwater up and waterlogging that habitat.
Is that also bringing in salt water?
It is bringing in salt water. It's making it harder and harder to find fresh water for drinking. It's making the wastewater treatment systems function less well. All of those things are impacted both by fresh water coming in and pushing up salt water coming in, pushing up the fresh water.
Yeah, and I've heard down at Cumberland Island National Seashore in Georgia that there's actually a freshwater lake of sorts on the national seashore, and there's concerns about saltwater infiltration, whether it's overwash or I don't know if it'd come up from below, but in the risk to that ecosystem.
That's happened in the Gateway National Recreation Area in New York, at the Jamaica Bay National Wildlife Refuge. There was a breach in what was a freshwater pond, and it is now a brackish pond, and that's really changed the habitat, the plants and the birds that are using it, and what people are able to see when they're there for recreation as well.
Talking about risks to salt marshes, I know at Cape Cod National Seashore in Massachusetts, they've done some restoration there. Are you familiar with that work, and has it been successful?
I don't know exactly which project you're talking about, but there has been a large amount of activity in salt marsh restoration across the Eastern Seaboard, in Massachusetts, Cape Cod, in Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and we're hoping to do some in New York as well, especially with modifications that we can make to restore that single channel hydrology, restoring the natural processes that help salt marshes do what they need to do and keep pace with sea level rise. I think that restoration of these habitats, not restoring them to some former condition, like snapshot condition that was mapped at some date previous, but restoring the natural processes to restore their ability to adapt and to respond to climate change is what we need to do. And that is sort of really the only way that we are going to be able to help these systems respond to climate change. And these, you look at it, a salt marsh, and you think, what a beautiful natural system. And they are natural systems, but they're not only natural systems, they're human ecological systems. We've been modifying these habitats for hundreds of years along the east coast of the US, longer than we previously appreciated. And so now people have a role to play in helping them respond to climate change too. We can't just say hands off and let them do their thing, because we have modified them to the point where they can't just do their own thing on their own. We need to fix the hydrology, fix the natural processes so that these natural systems, these human ecological systems, can persist into the future.
It is a great appreciation for that from the public because, as I understand it, salt marshes, wetlands really help buffer storm impacts. And you get rid of the salt marshes, you get rid of the wetlands, and those impacts are going to grow.
As scientists, we're always learning. We're always paying attention to how these systems respond to threats and restoration so that we can learn to do better. I'm not sure that the general public yet appreciates, and I think even as coastal scientists, our appreciation for how these are social ecological systems and need our assistance to persist into the future is growing. I think that sort of many coastal residents may not have that appreciation yet, that these natural systems that look like they should be able to fend for themselves need assistance from us people to do what we want them to be able to do.
And I think the science on the benefits of something like a salt marsh to the human communities behind them, the science on that is still quite young. And so we have a lot of work to do to put sort of the engineering style numbers and data and dollar signs behind that value. We all know that with physics, the way the physics works is all that grass in the salt marsh slows down waves and helps to reduce wave energy and lessen damage. And there have been a few studies to try to quantify that, but we have a lot more work to do to put hard numbers on it so that everyone feels as comfortable understanding those benefits as they do with benefits of more engineered structures.
Yeah, it's always kind of baffled me why when we talk about the national park system, we view it as an economic driver, how much money it's brought in tourism and in gateway to communities, as opposed to the natural capital that it provides. And that value is overlooked. And I think if you swap those viewpoints, here's the gateway community and the tax dollars that are raised thanks to business to national parks versus here the wetlands and the forests that clean the water and clean the air, and put a dollar figure on that. I'd like to believe that we would hold the national park system in higher esteem because of the values that it brings to us.
I think the National Park Service.
I think that's changing. The federal government has a long history of using dollars and cents as a way to sort of equalize different types of benefits so that you can compare apples to apples. And we're learning that that's not always a good way to do it because those more intrinsic values are much more difficult to put dollars and cents on. And so slowly but surely, different federal agencies are starting to recognize that we need to account for those social and ecological benefits on the same footing as the economic benefits. And there's work to do to figure out exactly how to do that, but there's recognition that that's necessary. Policies have been put in place that it has to happen. And so now all the agencies, including the Park Service, are trying to figure out how exactly to do that.
Yeah, I know there's been a number of papers out there that have put values on grizzly bears or values on coastal brown bears at Katmai National Park in Alaska. I think I even saw one on salt marshes. I'm going to have to go through my folders and see if I can't dig that one out, because I think this is an incredibly important aspect of what climate change is impacting. You look at national seashores and the dollars they bring in from photographers, from surfers, from surf casters. If we could really put a dollar figure on mitigating storm impacts, and I think there's also a figure out there for that as well.
Nature Conservancy scientists with the insurance industry did make an estimate. I think that the existing coastal salt marshes along the Eastern Seaboard saved over $625 million of damages that the insurance models projected would have happened had those salt marshes not attenuated that wave energy and reduced the damages there. So, but that's just one lens of the benefits of salt marshes. And as you alluded to, there are so many other benefits that we can't quantify as well for wildlife or fueling our coastal fisheries or cleaning our coastal waters that are harder to put a dollar value on.
Yeah.
And I think too, especially with parks, the rarity of the habitat is a really critical piece. There are so many areas, and I would argue maybe on the coast in particular, where it's our preserved land, national parks and other types of parks are some of the only intact salt marshes, for example, that we have left in New York. So I think that we need to find a way to sort of factor that into the equation as well, because all of the land that's been left to private ownership has damaged these coastal habitats. And so that makes our parks even more valuable because they're sort of the last of what's left.
Right. One aspect we've overlooked, and Dr. Maher, perhaps you can address it now. Reef systems, the Florida Reef, and the threats that it is facing. I know most of those threats, or I've heard most of those threats are tied to commercial fishing and whatnot. Is it also being impacted by climate change?
Oh, certainly. Coastal reefs are hugely impacted by climate change, by warming waters, so weakening and bleaching coral reefs. So climate is absolutely a huge threat to our more tropical coastal reefs.
A lot of research
Increasing storms sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say a lot.
Storms damages them as well because reefs grow very, very slowly. So if we're having more frequent and more damaging storms, then we're damaging our reefs more often and they're slow to grow back. And so they won't be able to keep pace with an increasing rate of hurricane.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of research being put into how to regrow coral reefs. I do understand that there were some coral reef nurseries, if you will, in Florida that while they were showing some promise, they were also hit pretty hard by last year's bleaching events in warmer ocean waters.
Right. There's a lot of active research going on right now, trying to figure out sort of super reefs or reefs that are sort of genetically predetermined to be able to survive in higher temperatures, or figuring out the most effective way to grow corals and build them back to our roots. And some of the Nature Conservancy's global marine team is doing some great work on that front.
So we've talked about the problems and the issues. What about the solutions? Dr. Branco, you've got that title of Climate Adaptation Director. How can we respond to these events and mitigate them or adapt to them?
There are a lot of options out there. They all have pros and cons, and they all need to be on the table. But I think what we really need to do is try to balance the needs of the human communities and the natural communities, because we need them both thriving if we're all going to survive on this planet long into the future. So first and foremost, to adapt to these changes, we need to keep the ecosystems that are still intact, especially the ones that are there, like salt marshes, beaches, and dunes that are protecting human communities. We need to leave them alone, not destroy them, not mess around with them, and give them the space that they need to adapt to changes in climate, such as rising sea level. And then where it's already too late for that, and we have developed and they are getting squeezed, we need to really think seriously when the habitat is being squeezed and the human communities are being harmed by flooding and storms. We need to think seriously about backing up and making some way for the additional water that we're going to see. We're already seeing a lot more flooding, and that's only going to get more frequent and more severe. So there are a lot of communities where we could see benefits both to the human community and the natural community, not by leaving entirely, but just by backing up a little bit and making way for all that water.
I'm curious, we're talking about coastal units of the national park system. Some of them have been built on the coast for a reason. Fort Pulaski National Monument in Georgia. You just go up the coast and you've got places like Cape Lookout and Cape Hatteras. Some of America's oldest history in terms of white settlers goes to Jamestown. All these places are at risk of being inundated and perhaps washed away as the years go by with sea level rise. Is there any way to protect these places?
I think it's different everywhere. I know on the Fire Island National Seashore, they're doing a lot of research now on how to preserve the lighthouse and how to change the type of materials that its foundation is made of so that it can better withstand being waterlogged with salt water a lot of the time. So, the parks are going to have to do a lot of research like that, especially all these coastal forts, to understand whether it's possible to keep them intact when they're getting more and more waterlogged. And then at some point, in some places anyway, I think that the fact that this was once high and dry and a great location for a fort, and it is now being inundated by water, becomes part of the history and part of the story that we're telling about our landscape.
Yeah, Dr. Branco, you mentioned the Fire Island Lighthouse. I wasn't aware of that work there, but it brings to mind down at Cape Hatteras right now, there's a massive restoration project with Cape Hatteras Light. I'll have to check into that, see if, I don't think it's that close to the water level, though, that it's probably higher and out of that zone.
My understanding was that the Cape Hatteras light, or maybe it was another southeastern light, was successfully moved from its original location. So that is an option. It was an option that was considered for the Montauk Point light, and the decision was made instead to try to hold that sand point in place. But we may be seeing the repercussions of that decision not to move that lighthouse back onto more state park land, because now a lot of the beaches along the south shore, the eastern end of Long Island, are feeling starved for that sediment that was eroding. Their supply was out by the Montauk Lighthouse.
Yeah. It was the Cape Hatteras Light that was moved a couple decades ago or so, and I forget exactly how far it was moved, but it was quite the event, and you can still see the path that it took to get to its present location. But I know in the restoration work that they're doing, they're trying to go back with a lot of natural grasses and whatnot surrounding the lighthouse with hopes that they'll be more adaptable. And we're seeing adaptation at Everglades National Park with some of the lodging. They've got tents that can be easily broken down and moved if a storm is coming. They just opened up a new lodge earlier this summer that is 12 feet above ground level, put it up on stilts, so to speak. Assateague Island National Seashore, I believe, has some easily movable facilities that they can pack up and move out of the way if a big storm is coming. So, it's for researchers, it's got to be an exciting time because there's a lot of things to look at and study and watch.
When you work on climate adaptation, it feels overwhelming. There's almost an unlimited amount of work to do, but it is an exciting time to be involved in a subject like this.
One thing we didn't get deeply into is freshwater systems. And I know we touched on the mangroves are showing up in places where there haven't been mangroves. What about the other ecological effects of that happening to freshwater systems being turned to brackish systems, to being, inundated by seawater? What species are being impacted by those? And are there any places we can point to where it's obviously ongoing?
Certainly freshwater wetland systems are even more threatened than coastal wetland systems here on the coast of New York. I don't work as much in freshwater systems, but there are certainly sort of ephemeral ponds and the amphibians that depend on those ephemeral ponds, and the limited freshwater wetlands that still exist along the coast of New York. It's a huge conservation threat. And our conservation partner, Seatuck Environmental Association, does a lot more work with freshwater wetlands and their resilience. Alison, do you want to?
I think that's a really important one, Nicole, to mention. It's not about the saltwater inundating the freshwater, but because our water cycle is changing so much because of climate change, we're having, in the Northeast, for example, we're not expecting a huge change in the overall annual rainfall amount, but we're expecting it to come in these big dramatic storms with longer droughts in between. And that can have a real impact on these intermittent streams and vernal pools and other ephemeral water bodies that rely on this really strange habitat where it's wet sometimes and dry sometimes, and only certain amphibians are adapted to that kind of system. And those are really threatened by this changing water cycle and the increasing droughts and increasing intensity of storms. So I think that's a really important one for freshwater. That happens on the coast and all throughout the interior of the country as well.
Yeah, it's really impacted the Great Salt Lake, as you might have heard.
Mm-hmm.
So you're both in New York, the big city?
We're both out on Long Island. I'm out on the North Shore in Huntington.
And I'm on the South Shore, pretty close to Fire Island.
Nice.
And Bay Shore.
How's the Back Bay doing?
Oh boy, I spend a lot of time on that. That's actually really a bigger concern for the Park Service these days, because the ocean side, it's the ocean beach, and the Army Corps is messing around with it a lot. So that's just sort of happening. They're very concerned about the bay side. There's tons of erosion happening on the bay side. And I mentioned the sunken forest when we were talking.
Right.
That's a really big concern for them. And there's almost nothing that we can do to keep this from happening and to keep this, I always say it's globally rare for a reason. It's almost inevitable that it's going to become waterlogged and really dramatically change, which is really sad, but also it's the reality of climate change. But they're really struggling to balance, like the historical values of all of those. There's a really big LGBTQ history on Fire Island, and a lot of those buildings associated with that history are Park Service buildings now, and they're all threatened by sea level rise. The shoreline, all of their ferry docks and marinas and everything are worsening the erosion. They're just really struggling with how best to manage that base side. I spend a lot of time talking to them about that.
I thought, though, the breach that Sandy created in the wilderness area really helped the Back Bay by infusing it with fresh ocean water. But now I'm hearing that things are not doing too well.
It has closed back up on its own,
right?
Which everyone sort of anticipated because, given the size of the bay and the tidal range, you can only keep so much cross-sectional area of opening. You can only expect so much opening to stay open.
Yeah.
And we have inlets elsewhere that we dredge and try to keep open. So this one did eventually close. It was great for the bay for many years. It was really flushing, improving water quality, getting a lot of that pollution in sort of the stagnant end of the bay out of there. And it's slowly going back to the way it used to be now.
Yeah, it was increasing. So increased water quality, increased growth rates of clams in the bay. But the new inlet formed at a place called Old Inlet for a reason. These they form, they subside. So the Park Service made the right decision to leave that breach open, not try to repair it, put it back together. And I think we benefited from having that new inlet open for the time that it was.
Yeah.
And now it's created more habitat. I, as a coastal ecologist interested in sediment movement and sediments helping to build marsh elevation, I thought those sand waves that were visible from aerial photography of the inlet were just so beautiful, because those sand waves can then be reworked within the Great South Bay system to fuel eelgrass beds and salt marsh meadows. So we need that influx of sediment and clean water as well.
Yeah.
Especially in a system like this bay where there's so much hardening has happened on the shoreline. It's really a sediment-starved system, which is not helping our salt marshes or our beaches. And so any time there's an overwash or a breach, it adds some more sediment to the system, which is just so important.
That's Dr. Branco, the Climate Adaptation Director for the Nature Conservancy, and Dr. Maher, the Senior Coastal Scientist also for the Nature Conservancy. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's going to be interesting, obviously watching the work that you guys are involved with and how it continues to evolve and hopefully some of the solutions that it points to. And it's definitely exciting times out there.
I agree. Thank you for the conversation, Kurt.
Thank you so much.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. In the weeks and months ahead, we'll continue to bring you different voices and stories from park units along the Eastern Seaboard that are at an increasing risk from sea level rise and more potent storms. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Rapinchak. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.